Alright, this is going to be the third book review video for this week. It's also for a book that I read 2 to 3 months ago, and I think I did shoot a video for it, but I never uploaded it because it was late and there were a lot of mistakes and things I left out. So this is Bayou of Pigs by Stuart Bell, concerning Operation Red Dog. And what that was is something that's been conflated with several other issues of the time. The eventual invasion of Grenada that we might touch upon, as well as David Duke, and even Ron Paul was dragged into it, even though I will try to make the case that he didn't really have involvement, but you can never know for sure, and it was never proven. But in any case, what happened in 1979, I believe, was the overthrow of Eric Gary. He was the dictator of Grenada at the time, and he had been, in a manner of speaking, a Western pawn. He had been a activist for independence of Grenada when it was a British colony. But once it became independent, he simply became one of these very complacent politicians that didn't want to change anything. So, of course, in 1983, the U.S. did overthrow the revolutionary government that came after him, which was the New Jewel movement government of, I think his name was Hudson Austin. So Austin had overthrown Maurice Bishop and murdered him. Bishop had been the revolutionary that overthrew Eric Gary. That is the story of what happened in Grenada. What is not connected to that was that originally there was a group of wannabe mercenaries that decided that they wanted to overthrow the Bishop government and replace it with their own group of people who would basically run Grenada along with Eric Gary and turn it into their paradise where they could do all sorts of things like being a drug couriers, as well as running gambling casinos, things like that. Basically turn it into what Cuba had been before the Cuban Revolution, except much, much more crooked and less accountable. Now, at a certain point, though, it became obvious that Grenada would not be a soft target simply because there was involvement of Eastern Bloc countries. Remember, this was the 80s. This was the actual height of the Cold War, the old Cold War, since it's possible the new one could be starting already. Anyway, so Grenada was being built up by Cuban construction workers who were going to use it as a refueling point for their forces that were in Africa during the Angolan Civil War. That's a chapter of the Cold War that nobody talks about. Cuban and Soviet intervention in Africa and how Grenada was to be used for that. Now, this group of mercenaries was led by a gentleman named Mike Perdue. And maybe I can give you a photo of Mike Perdue. There's not much about him. In fact, he's very much seen as this. I think this is him. So he's kind of a shadowy figure. There's not that many people who know him. This is the guy to the left, to the right maybe. Here we go. So the right of your screen, you can see this was Mike Perdue. And what he decided to do, Mike Perdue was not in the Klan. He did have a little bit of a racist background, but he decided to recruit from people in the Klan. According to the book, at least, there's no evidence that David Duke, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana, had, or he was, I think at that time he'd already exited the Klan. There's no evidence that he took an active part in it. And the truth is that there's no evidence establishing Duke's full participation in it. But what is said in the book is that he recommended to Mike Perdue that he engage with a certain Canadian racist named Don Andrews, another activist for one of these groups, basically the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. And he told him, well, I'm not interested in taking part in this, but you can go speak to my friend Don Andrews over in Ontario. And that's where he went. And the majority of the main players in this shenanigan were from Canada, including not just people in the Klan. There was in fact an organized crime figure named Maurice Yanover, who is actually Jewish. So the fact is that this was a plot that involved the Ku Klux Klan, but it had nothing to do with a racial goal. It had more to do with making money and being able to have a country of their own. However, as stated before, Grenada was no longer a soft target, so they shifted to the island of Dominica, which had a different government at the time. So it was led by Eugenia Charles. Okay. And she'd been the prime minister for a very short time and had replaced a different person who was the original prime minister at independence. His name was Patrick John. Okay, the first prime minister was Patrick John, and he had been the prime minister at the time of independence. Similar to Eric Gary, Patrick John was somewhat corrupt, and during a hurricane in 1979, he basically dropped the ball, and then he was overthrown and had to flee the island. And then Patrick John was contacted by Mike Perdue and his group of people. Actually, no, he didn't even flee the island. I believe he was just imprisoned there. So they then visited the island. They came into contact with some of Patrick John's old loyalists and started this plot to have a two-pronged attack, including both the mercenaries and local people, as well as a certain sect of Rastafarians. This is, I mean, I know it's getting crazy. So these neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan's members, some underground organized crime figures from Toronto, the former prime minister of Dominica, and some Rastafarian people were going to overthrow Eugenia Charles and impose this anarchic government. This government where basically they would control the economy and they would loot and plunder the country and generally use it as their own personal piggy banks. So, unfortunately for them, a lot of the misfortune was in the fact that Mike Perdue, who was the person who ran this quote-unquote operation, this guy, didn't know what the hell he was doing. And eventually when it came time, so most of his efforts were in order to get money to invest in this and get more gear. So he was going around the country, meeting people in Vegas, meeting people in Memphis, all over the country, trying to get people to pour money into this because he personally just wasn't very rich. He had a certain person he was connected to that gave him money for personal expenses. And that person, you'll read a little bit about him in the book. Not going to ruin it for you. But let's just say that their relationship was a little too close for what people in the Klan would normally deem a normal relationship between two gentlemen. So anyway, this guy, he was, flapping his gums a lot. He was talking a lot to people about this and saying, oh, you can make this much money or whatever. It came to be that they decided to contract and charter a boat from New Orleans to Dominica, which would take, I think they said it was like a week's journey by sea, and then invade the island. Okay, originally, originally their plot had been, before they decided on Dominica, that they would use Dominica as a launch point to invade Grenada. Now, let's look at a map of Eastern Caribbean. So this is the Caribbean Sea, and damn it. Okay, here we go. So Dominica's over here, and they would have had to sail all through the Windward Islands to Grenada. So they would have had to sail originally from New Orleans all the way around Key West through, past Cuban waters. So that was already a stupid idea. Or this way through the Caymans and Jamaica all the way to Dominica, and then use that as a drop off, as a transit point to attack Grenada. So essentially, it didn't make a difference where they started off. But in the end, they decided they were just going to invade and overthrow the government of Dominica. The problem is that this person immediately went to the ATF, okay? And he decided, hey, I don't want to be basically transporting all of these hopped up Klansmen with their guns who could, just decide to shoot me and take my boat and invade this island. At any point, they could have just turned their guns on them, as was likely to happen, because Mike Perdue was not exactly the most reliable and trustworthy person. So he just told the ATF. So these guys were arrested, and there were... What's very interesting is that there is a number of subplots to it, including various spies that they sent to the island, including Maurice Yaniver, including an Irish woman who was also living in Canada and working as a nurse, who they sent to the island, and she was supposed to spy for them, and she got arrested and thrown into prison. And then eventually a friend of hers decided to come to the island and try to rescue her, and he got arrested. So it was a huge, huge failure. Now, Mike Perdue got arrested. Don Black, who was also another leader of the Klan at the time, was arrested. And a number of other people. Wolfgang Druga, who was the main Canadian operative in the plot, he was arrested. So generally, it was a total catastrophe. And even later, when some of them got out of prison, I believe it was Droga, he moved to British Columbia and attempted to restart the plot, and it went nowhere because the Canadian and American governments were keeping tabs on them. So this is what's so ridiculous, that these people, most of whom, okay, some of them did have military training, but the majority of them didn't. Most of them were just these dudes that lived out in trailers or were living in, small factory towns in Ontario. And they were told, oh, you're going to make so much money off of this, but they didn't have any military training. So they were going to, some of them were just bringing, 38 revolvers to invade a country. So that was the main mistake. Now, David Duke swore up and down that he didn't have, later he would swear up and down that he didn't have any involvement in it. Now, the truth is that according to testimony from 1981, to a grand jury, he did have some involvement in it. Okay? Now, 9 men were convicted of violating the Neutrality Act. They included Don Black, a close Duke Klan associate, now married to Duke's ex-wife. Duke testified before a grand jury, but the government was unable to make a case against him. We always thought Duke was involved in some way, former U.S. Attorney Lindsay Larson told Newsweek. In 1983, Duke called the AP to report his involvement in the plot. He now denies making the statement. So this is interesting. We don't know for sure whether... So this article that I'm citing, it's not from Newsweek recently. It's from Newsweek from 1991 when Duke was running for governor of Louisiana. So bear in mind, a lot's changed at Newsweek since then. I'm not saying that they were a good magazine at the time because I was 6 years old, and I'm not going to try to humor you on whether the mainstream media in 1991 relied on facts and evidence or they were making things up. But David Duke did admit to Stuart Bell in this book, this one, that he recommended that Mike Perdue go and contact Don Andrews. So my personal opinion, okay, is that you have to take everything with a grain of salt, including both Newsweek and David Duke. So I don't believe necessarily that David Duke had a deep involvement in what happened, but I do believe that he was in full contact with some of the people, especially Don Black at the time. I think that he was probably a little more deeply involved in recruiting the people that were going to carry it out. But he didn't put any personal stake in it. He didn't invest in it personally, whether through funding or through his own participation, because that's not the type of person he is. David Duke, for those of you that don't know, is he's a fraud who has peddled his crap for many years. Some people like to append to David Duke and his cohorts the label of conspiracy theorists. But I think conspiracy theorists, okay, conspiracy theorists have to have at least some sort of thread that keeps them anchored to something. Okay, most conspiracy theories do have some sort of reflection of the truth in them, right? With David Duke, this is a person who has, over the years, of course, he claims that he's not racist against blacks, but obviously he was in the Klan. He was very active in harassing black people throughout the country in the 80s and, picketing black businesses and things like that. David Duke is basically a person who, and don't forget also with the Jews. So he has attributed every problem throughout his career to Jewish influence, including the author Philip Roth, who recently died. So this is a guy who is not exactly the paragon of real character. So when you hear him try to deny something or try to take credit for something, you don't know which way to go. You don't know whether he was involved or more or less deeply involved. He's actually hosted someone on his show that I debated last year who is completely full of crap. And I think that they deserve each other. This is a guy who, like that person, actually said that Jeremy Corbyn is sunshine.
James Corbyn, the new elected Labour leader.
Well, okay, it was James Corbyn because he didn't know his name.
Had actually, invited you to speak at events, just as I invited you to speak. And also Paul Eisen. And that they've been very supportive of, they've been very opposed to the Zionist issues and the Zionist powers in Great Britain. So what do you make of all this, and what's going on over there?
Well, it's quite clear that the fear that we're going to get anywhere with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the British Labour Party has made them pull out all the stops to denigrate all the people he's associated with that they can think of who could be denigrated. And unfortunately, or depending on your opinion, I was one of them. I've been a long-standing friend of Jeremy's, mainly over the war in Iraq. He was one of the few to stand up against that in Parliament and try to avert it. He spoke very eloquently against the Tony Blair linkage with Bush and co. on attacking Iraq. And he's also spoken up for the Palestinians and against the crimes against them by the Israelis. So he's feared by the Jewish lobby, basically. I'm assuming that everybody knows that the Jewish lobby was behind the war in Iraq. So there are two areas where he's, in quotes, offended the powers that be. And as you said earlier, you can tell who's running the country by those people you're not allowed to offend. I think it was a statement.
And who you're not allowed to associate with, right? Like people like yourself, possibly. Myself, and
yes.
Paul Eisen.
Well, that'll have to be added in.
So you have them, David Duke and James Thring, expressing support for Jeremy Corbyn based on this notion that Corbyn was an anti-interventionist and he opposed the war in Iraq. David Duke, at least back in the early 80s, supported an invasion of Grenada or Dominica on behalf of this group of people who they're not going to free Dominica of communism, which is something that, by the way, in the book, they kept calling Eugenia Charles a communist and Patrick John a supporter of freedom. It's actually the opposite. Eugenia Charles had been an opponent of communism. She'd been a supporter of Margaret Thatcher, the British prime minister, and supported a deeper alliance between Dominica and the UK. And she'd actually visited Reagan and given support for him, and eventually she would support the invasion in Grenada. So this whole characterization of themselves as being these ultimate anti-interventionists, it's belied by this example of what happened in the 80s in the Caribbean. So when it's convenient for them, David Duke and his cohorts, they talk about Western morality. They talk about the fact that they're protecting the white Christian culture and the family and everything. David Duke's been in prison for all sorts of things, such as defrauding his followers in insurance scams. He's been through a lot of troubles because of his gambling habit. He's just a complete liar. That's the type of person he is. Again, so this is not really about David Duke. The book itself deals a lot more with, and he's really a bit character in it. But I felt like it would be important to mention that both him and Ron Paul were mentioned in the book. Now, Ron Paul, the fact is that there's much less evidence against him. The only thing that was brought as some sort of tie between him and that was that Mike Perdue was claiming that Ron Paul was aware and supported the invasion. There was never any actual presented evidence of any of that. So I would say this. David Duke is acknowledged to have known about the plot to overthrow Eugenia Charles through Mike Perdue. He recommended to Mike Perdue how to find people that would be willing accomplices in the invasion. So I would say that, yes, his credentials as an anti-interventionist, which I think is a huge fig leaf for his other ridiculous ideas, I would say that this example of what he said in Bayou of Pigs, even the small role that he acknowledged to this day, that refutes the idea that he's an anti-interventionist. He's simply a liar and an opportunist and has absolutely no credibility. As for Ron Paul, there's very little else to talk about. Nobody else associated with Ron Paul, unlike David Duke, was caught up and arrested and indicted and then prosecuted for this saga. So this is a great book. Obviously, if you're cooped up, it reads like a novel. It's almost too crazy to be true, but it did happen, and these people did go to jail. And ultimately, I think that it shows a lot of these movements that talk about, race, politics, and things like that. They don't attract people that are known for their careful planning and integrity. So that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me at all of these mediums. You got YouTube, which you're probably watching on, or BitChute, and Minds.com, Subscribestar, as well as Gab. I'll talk to you later.